Hello and welcome. My name is Jackie Cuyvers. I'm CEO and co-founder of Convosphere. Convosphere is a social intelligence agency where we work in over 45 languages to provide global reach and local insights and deliver deep cultural insights that bring our global clients closer to local audiences across industries and markets. Today, I'll be taking you through mapping the patient's emotional journey, which we found to be a really useful way to gain insights across the entire patient journey. So, going beyond just positive or negative sentiments, understanding the emotional journey that they go through during the diagnosis, treatment, etc., it's easier to understand the barriers or drivers that patients have to things like adoption of new medications, switching between treatments or medications, or even adherence issues. So thank you for joining me. Let's get started. In this session today, I'm going to first be covering why we would map the emotional journey, then going into what that looks like when we've done it, so you have an idea of what the end result looks like, and then lastly, how to do it. So I'm hoping that by the end of this course, you'll come out of this having a good understanding of how deep you can go, what you can do with that analysis and the results for your clients' projects, and feel much more comfortable doing it yourself as a project. Right. This poll thingy is still here. There, it's gone now. So let's get started. So why use social listening to understand the patient's emotional journey? It's a good question, right? Many of you probably have relied on surveys or interviews to understand the patient's experience, but social listening offers a tremendous opportunity to understand the experience of patients and caregivers and HCPs. So social listening is the actual process of using online conversations to answer these business questions with actionable insight. It's an approach or a technique, much like interviewing is. Social intelligence is the output and application of the insight. So it's what do you do with it once you have the information and the findings. So traditionally, social listening has been used to not just understand unmet needs of patients or to do a therapy area overview, but it also offers insight into the emotions that these patients, caregivers, HCPs may be experiencing, right? People are sharing online on forums, blogs, and websites their opinions about treatments they're receiving, concerns they may have about a loved one who's been recently diagnosed. So social listening allows us to gather and analyze these conversations as a data set, and social intelligence is the output that allows us to make actionable insights and recommendations that help our clients do business differently. So it's really useful in knowing your stakeholders and your business better. So in this case, the stakeholders would be caregivers, HCPs, and patients. Depending on the therapeutic area, HCPs, generally represent the smallest share of the stakeholder conversations or data set, but that can range anywhere from 2% up to 15% of the conversation. In this case, we are looking at understanding the patients, because we're trying to understand not just the patient journey, but the emotional journey. As you may be aware, there's an overall kind of average journey, which is symptoms, diagnosis, treatment. But the level of complexity of that varies by therapeutic area. So you take something that's a chronic disease like multiple sclerosis, and it's because it's chronic, in many ways it is linear, except towards after the treatment stage, whether it goes into remission or the patient relapses, which is quite a different process than something like infertility, when they receive the treatment and you either have a positive experience with the treatment and you have a baby, or else you go back into the treatment kind of process, and your journey continues. So in some ways, it's less linear and cyclical. So that's really good in helping you understand the journey that the different stakeholders are experiencing, but it doesn't help you go to the depth of insight that you need to make really strategic data-driven decisions. And understanding the emotions that patients are experiencing along that patient journey helps you understand what can have an impact on the not just the patient experience, but things like adoption of treatments, switching between treatments, becoming non-adherent. So if you think about it, if you use automated sentiment from a social listening tool, and you look up something like cancer, well, the automated tools use the same algorithms on these health conversations as they do automotive or consumer goods or even fashion. So the sentiment, while it's only displayed as positive, negative, and neutral, isn't very nuanced in understanding, when someone's talking about their specific health condition versus applying positive or negative or neutral sentiment to someone talking about their car. So it doesn't go very deep, and it's not very accurate. But when you can, if you looked at something like MS or cancer, many of these automated sentiments would show the majority of the conversation as neutral and the rest negative and a very little bit positive. But that doesn't help you understand anything or answer any business questions. So understanding the emotions that sit behind that sentiment becomes really important and can be very powerful. So for example, while tool-based sentiments can be really good in providing you an overview, it's a blunt instrument. So it can give you the quantitative analysis and answer questions like, what is my share of voice in comparison to competitors? What are the key themes driving conversation? Which brands, products, issues are mentioned the most? It doesn't really let you understand the why of, are these topics mentioned or these themes mentioned? And the issues, it doesn't help you prioritize them in terms of these issues are barriers to adopting a new treatment or medication. So what we do is we don't use automated tools to do that. We use human analysis, so humans manually reviewing and coding the data for the emotions across the journey phases. And this is really important because the data set that you're working from are human conversations. These are people on patient forums or on social media asking questions of other patients or caregivers, sharing their personal experience, and things that you can start to understand both quantitatively and qualitatively when you're looking at the emotional journey and doing this manual coding are things like, what are the fears or barriers to starting a new treatment? How is this treatment impacting their lives? When you understand, what these emotions are, you can then understand and hopefully provide insight and recommendations on how to overcome things like non-adherence. So to do this, to not use an automated sentiment and to understand and to have a language that you can use to categorize the emotions, we actually use Plutchek's wheel of emotions. So Plutchek was a psychologist, and he said there's 7 basic emotions. So that's this kind of third ring down of joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, and anticipation. And then there are varying levels of depth in those emotions. We, when we're working with the emotional analysis, use those 7 basic emotions to categorize the conversation or the posts within our data set. So one of the things that you need to understand is that this can be expressed in different ways in different cultures. So we do the social listening and the analysis and the coding of these emotions in the native language. So we don't use Google Translate to translate that, because often meaning can get lost, and some kind of idioms or sense of humor or even tone of voice can have a cultural context. So having the analysis done, in the native language is really important. Another thing that you need to do when you're starting this is to take example conversations and show how they fit these emotional kind of tags, or are codified in this way. So for example, we would have a meeting where we sit down and run through a number of conversations, and we all agree and are in alignment that this conversation or post conveys fear. So you need to have, especially if you're working with more than one person on this project, an alignment and understanding of what these emotions look like within the context of the therapeutic area or the data set that you're working in. So that was the why. Why use emotions, an emotional analysis when looking at the patient journey. Next is what. What does this look like? So we've put together some analysis, which I'm going to share with you, about multiple sclerosis, both mapping out the patient's emotional journey along the patient journey, and then developing some profiles or personas of some of the key stakeholders that we saw within the conversational data set within the therapeutic area. And then lastly, I'm going to show you a deep dive into the treatment phase, looking at a specific category of treatment, biologics, to understand, again, looking at not the macro view of MS, but with a micro view of the emotions within the treatment phase, within the biologics category, so you can understand how deep you can go with this and the type of insights that you can get out of this. Then after that, I'll show you how we did it, so you can do it too. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that the emotional analysis can be done at a very high level across the entire kind of data set of conversations across the all MS conversations. So this was looking at all MS conversations that happened over the last year in the US. So that was about 250,000 conversations. And the stakeholders in this were patients, caregivers, and HCPs. So the overall, this was the automated, in a way, scoring provided by the tool, which you can see is quite different than the emotional analysis that we've done manually. So at a high level, the positive, negative, neutral, you see that the majority here is neutral, with 54% neutral. That's fairly common when using automated sentiment on a whole therapeutic area. However, when you look at what we've done, when we've taken a sample size of that total data set, actually the largest emotional driver was frustration. And this frustration was happening pre-diagnosis, about trying to get the proper diagnosis, and before they started the treatments. But if you just relied on the sentiment analysis provided by the tools, you wouldn't have the same level of understanding about what's actually driving the emotions. So conversations around MS are very patient-driven. So it's a chronic disease. The people who have this often have it for quite some time, and they have a large presence and are very vocal across online channels like forums, websites, groups, and social media like Facebook groups and Twitter, as well as non-patient kind of focused forums like Reddit. So it's unsurprising that we see the majority of conversation, 77% here, is by patients. And then when we look at the type of MS, or where they are within their journey, it's we're able to define the different categories of of the disease progression of their multiple sclerosis. When you look at the conversation and the data set, not just as a large data set, but how it's occurred over the course of the year, it's fairly typical that things like celebrity mentions, in this case, Selma Blair and David Blatt, who's a basketball player, drove peaks in conversation. But you can see that over the course of the year, there's an ongoing conversation that's happening with peaks driven by newsworthy events like celebrity diagnosis, World Awareness Days, and fundraising. So patients and HCPs were the most likely to speak on Twitter, and whereas caregivers were more often seen on forums. Patients were there as well. This is fairly typical of different therapeutic areas, and we would expect to see the HCPs primarily on Twitter. So HCPs, as I mentioned, generally represent a smaller subset of the stakeholder participation in a therapeutic area. And on Twitter, they are 60% of the time just resharing news and awareness information without adding any personal commentary or context. It is generally around congresses or conferences where we see them giving their own opinion or sharing new information or their perception of things. But it's most common to see them just resharing information. Patients are quite vocal on forums, and it's there that you can really get into the depth of the emotions that they're experiencing. So patients are posting on Twitter, they're sharing their personal experiences, their symptoms and treatment, whereas HCPs are more sharing news and research, and caregivers are having an ongoing conversation on these forums, worrying about their loved ones, trying to work with them through their treatments, and looking for support from peers and others. So looking at the overall kind of themes or that patients experience, or the challenges that they experience both a social impact, physical impact, and emotional impact from MS, this chronic disease. So patients have to use different mobility devices in order to assist them. So walking can be difficult for different patients. The emotional impact is quite stressful. There's a financial burden. They can often become depressed because of lack of efficacy or side effects from treatments, and frustration about the treatments and the implications of the diagnosis. And it puts limits on their life and have them struggling in different personal and professional relationships. So when looking at the journey, we look at the journey both quantitatively and qualitatively. So the analysis that we've done, which I'm going to show you how to do this, first you codify the conversations by where they are in the stage of their journey. So this is before you even get to the emotional. Where are they in their phase of the journey? So in this case, the majority of the conversation is focused on the treatment phase. So 49% of the conversations that we analyzed were in the treatment phase. And then there you can actually, deep dive into the specific classes or categories of treatment, time since diagnosis, their emotions, about the treatment options, and so forth. So I know this is fairly typical of what you would expect to see along a patient journey. But where it gets more interesting then is along that same journey, starting to categorize and understand the emotions that they're feeling. Unsurprisingly, pre-diagnosis is the lowest point for what the patients are feeling. They're feeling worried, they're feeling sad, they're feeling frustrated that they don't have a clear diagnosis at the pre-diagnosis phase. They know something's going wrong, but they don't know what to do and what's going on. after they receive the diagnosis and they start the treatment, they become more hopeful. And you can start to see that they're, the more they learn about their situation, the more control they feel they have, and the more treatments, may be assisting them in their condition. So if we look at a little bit of a highlight per stage, again, pre-diagnosis, people are worried, sad, and frustrated and have concerns. At diagnosis, again, they're still frustrated, but they are feeling like they're starting to get the tests that are going to lead them to the answers. And then the treatment phase is, where you start to see the emotions really changing, where you're starting to see hope that the treatment will be effective. You're starting to see happiness that they've started a new treatment, and, or there's new treatment opportunities for them. And this is where, we're seeing a large change. The management, once they've been on treatment for a while, is where they start getting frustrated, but they're still, whether it was lack of efficacy. And here are points when understanding, what these drivers are that may have an impact for better understanding and managing things like switching behavior, adherence to their medicine or their treatment options, or even just identifying unmet needs that may stand in the way of successful treatment. Right, so that was the what in terms of the macro view of MS, the patient journey and the emotional journey. Next is personas. So using the same data set and the same coding frame to do the manual analysis that we've done in identifying the stakeholders and identifying the stage in the journey and the emotions that they've experienced, we now have a rich spreadsheet that has been fully codified for each conversation that we're able to use to understand patterns of attitudes, behaviors, treatments, time since diagnosis, age, all of these things, both in a quantitative and qualitative way. In looking at them quantitatively, it helps us identify the attitudes, behaviors that then we can start to see segments developing, or specific patterns, which then allow us to develop a one-page persona that gives kind of an overview of the type of patient or behavior that we see within the community or data set. So in this one, this is an example of, we've called her Rachel in this case, who has been was diagnosed with MS 10 years ago. She has been having treatments. She has some of the treatments have been effective, but she feels like they've had a positive effect, but she's concerned about how biologics may be compromising her immune system. So she's communicating on Twitter and blogs, and she has concerns about cost and side effects. Whereas Tom, a male patient, is active on Twitter and forums. He is more interested in pursuing lifestyle management, in this case cannabis, which was mentioned quite a bit in the data set by patients, to manage his day-to-day symptoms. And he has frustration with his symptoms and lacks access to adequate healthcare or treatment options. Finally, we have June, a caregiver. She's been, her mother has had MS for 15 years, and it's been progressive. She's not the full-time carer, her father is, but she's quite active in the community of MS on forums, speaking with other caregivers and patients and helping raise awareness and understand how best to support her mother. So when you have those personas and you understand the emotional journey that the patients are going through at a macro level, you can then use those personas to understand how when looking at specific categories of drugs or class of treatments and drugs within the treatment phase may impact those different persona types. So in this case, within the treatment phase, we're looking specifically at biologics. So biologics, patients with MS can have oral drugs, injections, and biologics, which are the newer option, but are are seen by patients not always as positively as the oral medication. And there are many reasons for that, which, once you understand that there's a difference between the emotions, you can understand what's driving the positive emotions for one or the other. Is it route of administration? Is it efficacy? Is it side effects? But that can serve as a starting point for you to understand where you need to look deeper. So in this case, when discussing biologics, the conversation was mainly driven by women. It was mainly driven by patients themselves and discussing their kind of experience in detail. Interesting, the positive aspects of biologic treatments were that they were hopeful that it was going to be efficacious. They were happy about the treatment and how effective it was with limited side effects. And they were, showing determination and trust in they felt confident that these new medications were going to help them. However, the negative drivers of conversations around biologics, one, because this is the US, one of the kind of pain points or barriers here is the cost of the treatment. So that is prohibitive for some patients. So that led to some of them being, frustrated and sad and worried about the cost, and then also concerned about potential side effects and, the overall kind of experience. So that's at a category level. You can also go deeper when looking at the sentiments around specific products or brands. In this case, so Cuyvers was the biologic that was most mentioned, and it also had the largest positive sentiment around that. So when you kind of do a deeper dive, into these specific phases of the patient journey, looking from an emotional lens, it really uncovers, a lot of the insights that can help you understand the patient better and, provide actionable insights and recommendations on how to do business differently, how to create better medical education, how to address these unmet needs, and overcome things like, concerns around efficacy, adherence, and better understand switching behavior. Right, so now we're on to how. How are you going to do this, right? And I think that's pretty much why you guys are here, right? To understand how to do this. So first, you start with the business question. You start with the question. In this case, it was broadly MS. What is the emotional journey of MS patients? So you start wide, and then you narrow your data set down to answer for that. So to get started, we generally start with a little bit of desk research to understand kind of patient communities, to understand the disease overview. You can go to the NHS websites or Mayo Clinic to understand, the different discussions around symptoms, causes, diagnosis, treatment. That sets the kind of framework for your understanding of the therapeutic area and the language that both comes from a medical perspective, a pharma company perspective, and a patient perspective, right? Because there's no patient who has ever logged on to Twitter and said, my unmet needs are, that's just not the way people speak, but that's how pharma speaks. So understanding the language that both use is very important, because how you collect this data set is by gathering keywords and creating a Boolean query. So the Boolean query is what kind of sets the parameters for your data set, and the tools help you gather that. But then the insight generation and how you analyze the data and report on it is a very human process. So you need both the technology and the team to do this. So you start with the Boolean query. So a Boolean query is almost like a math equation. So you would include the exact phrase multiple sclerosis, or misspellings of that, or progressive MS, or relapsing remitting MS. And then in this case, if you were also looking for it within context of the symptoms that people are experiencing, then you'd also include symptoms, or you could do it in context of treatment. And then also, in addition to treatment, all of the names of the possible treatments. So that sets the kind of parameters for your data set. But it's an iterative process. because as I bet you can imagine, you would put this query into the tool, you get your data set, you see that some of the conversations are actually about Microsoft MS. So then you may need to do revisions or iterations on your query to get a really clean data set. Then after you have this clean data set, where you can look historically over the past 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, however far back you want to go. You've set the parameters, which are looking for these MS conversations. You've got that. This is your data collection. Then what we generally do, because we're trying to understand the stakeholders, the patient, caregiver, and HCP experience, we look at a subset of that data. We do a further query to refine the data set for first-person conversations. So that weeds out things like press releases, industry news, and it really focuses on people talking from their personal experience about MS, whether that's the patient, caregiver, or the HCP. Then within that data set, you can then further refine it down by the drivers or perceptions of the stakeholders, or even by the stakeholders themselves. So only looking at the HCPs, etc. So there you've got your data, and you've refined the data set, and now you are you're ready to work with it. So how do you gather the data? So it's really important that you understand that there are tools out there. So in this case, social listening tools. So something like a TalkWalker or a BrandWatch or a Sysomos, they're all very, very similar. They license data. They've been collecting it and storing it away in their data sets for years. They collect 30 to 40 million pieces of new data every day, which could be a forum post, it could be a blog post, a website content, it could be a Facebook public group post, it could be a tweet, it could be an Instagram post, it could be any of these different things, and it's sitting there in their data set, and it is sitting there for you to use to do your analysis. So these tools you can use, they are generally licensed. You might already have access to one or two. And it's important that you use something like a social listening tool, that you don't just use scrapers or web crawlers to just go and gather the data. While it's technically possible, you don't really want to run that risk. And the reasons are because of different restrictions on data privacy that may be global or regional, like California privacy or GDPR, site-specific licensing. So just going out and scraping content or ingesting content from Facebook, it violates their terms and conditions. So you don't want to just scrape the data. You need to use a licensed data set or tool like these social listening platforms that license the data from Twitter, that license the data from Facebook, Reddit, forums, etc. And even though they do have content from these different social media channels, the tech companies themselves, the social media companies, in particular Facebook and Instagram, have begun to really set limits on what they will make available. And it's difficult to get historical information as well. So if you have, let's say, ASCO is coming up, or another Congress that you want to gather all of the data for, it's something that you have to initiate in advance and kind of collect the data as you go along, versus looking historically might be difficult in something like that where you want to focus on social media specifically. Lastly, while these social listening tools gather public data sets, public-facing Facebook groups, public-facing Facebook profiles, public tweets, public forums like Reddit, there is the ability to license on a per project basis data sets that can be really useful to pharma and life sciences. So in particular, we use Sermo forum data, which is an HCP peer-to-peer forum, often on our projects. We also, there's lots of different data sets out there that, while they may not be readily available in a social listening tool, you may be able to use on a per project license basis. Right, so now you've got your data set. So as I mentioned, the different tools, the social listening tools themselves are used by different industries. So we generally pull the data out of the social listening tool. We don't depend on its analytics, and we take a very human approach. And then we kind of clean the data set. So we get rid of junk posts or, buy Canadian drugs online type thing. And we make sure it's a clean data set before we work with it. So at this point, it's in Excel. We go back and we build a kind of coding framework. So these are questions or things that we're answering based on our business question, that when we read the post in the line here, and we can click on the URL, which shows us maybe the forum post in context of the post before it and the post after, we can then begin to code things like where this conversation, where this discussioning is happening in their journey stage, what type of treatment it mentions, what are the demographics of the patient who's doing the talking, which then gives us this really kind of rich and detailed data set, which we then use for our quantitative analysis and our qualitative analysis. So the post plus the coding lets us then, generate the insights. And this insight generation, the qualitative, is generally by the analysts coming back together and discussing their findings. So we all are aligned on the quantitative, but the qualitative is not just the findings, but the so what, right? And how does this relate back to the original business question, and what are our recommendations for the business question based on what we're seeing. In developing the persona, because you have that very rich and detailed coding spreadsheet, you can identify these kind of audience attitudes, behaviors, segments, to then see these patterns happening, which then let you develop these patient personas. And the deep dive that I showed you into the biologics treatment helps you kind of contextualize the category and potentially the brand of product. So you're not just looking at the overall treatment of, what is the day-to-day impact on the condition of life, but by looking at the emotions and doing that deep dive into it, you can begin to understand things like, the emotions that they feel having this category of treatment or the brand. You can understand what they've tried in the past and why they made these switch behaviors or changed. So a deep dive into the treatment phase can help you really understand these things. So you start off with the broad view, the macro view. So you've got the full view of the MS landscape. Then from that, you do your analysis, you map out the patient journey, and you can then develop your stakeholder personas. And then you have the micro view where you're focusing in on each stage. So when you're focusing, you have your personas and you're focusing in on the treatment phase, you really understand, by looking at the emotions, the impact on those personas or patient type or caregivers within the context. Right. And so what do you need to make that happen? You need the right team. So you need people to do the work who understand the business question and then the context of the data set. You need the tools. So you need the team to be in contact, but have access to both the client's business questions, and you need the time for your team to align on your analysis and then your insights recommendations. And then you need the tools to help facilitate the data collection and your analysis. And then a few common misconceptions are, is social data or online data representative? It really is, because even if, say, a Parkinson's patient is not speaking about their experience online, their adult caregivers and their physician are. The data is out there. There's millions of pieces of conversation and data that's happening on every therapeutic area, even rare diseases, and the answers are unsolicited, so there's no interviewer bias, and it reaches it reaches patients, HCPs, and caregivers globally. So you can understand the differences by market or
by the experience in different countries. And then I think the last misconception maybe that one of the things that we get asked is to show interim uh, insights. So once you start your analysis and you're doing that kind of reviewing, analyzing, and coding of the conversations and the data set, to provide an interim report, you'd have to stop doing the analysis and and make a report or finding that really doesn't include the entire data set. So it's quite difficult to do. Um, and then I guess the other one would be, how long does it take to do this and do it well? This is probably a 2 to 4 week project.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I really appreciate your interest and participation. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact us. We're always happy to talk about this or other social intelligence projects or methodologies.